Bonjour, I'm Ivy Vineo, and what you're about to listen to is First Light, Carl Gawboy, Wendy Savage, and the Ojibwe Art Expo. This is a 3-part series diving into the Anishinaabe art scene past and present with 2 of Minnesota's established and respected Ojibwe artists who were heavily involved in the Ojibwe Art Expo. You've heard of it, right? It was a mostly annual traveling exhibition for several decades. It got started in the late 1960s and was partly inspired by the vibrant and growing American Indian art scene in Santa Fe at that time. This series is for anyone who wants an inside look at Native art history in Minnesota, representation and support or lack thereof, and how American Indian art has evolved and positively impacted the lives of so many Native artists over the past 40 to 50 years. White Earth Nation direct descendant Jill Dorfler serves as the interviewer for this series. This program was made possible through the support from Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, Arrowhead Regional Arts Council, and Northland Foundation's Mataukin Grant. In this episode of First Light, Carl Gawboy, Wendy Savage, and the Ojibwe Art Expo, Wendy and Carl introduce themselves and share some memories and experiences from their early careers as artists. Carl Gawboy is Boisfort Ojibwe and Finnish American. He has had 60-plus years in the art world, including watercolor artist, muralist, teacher, book author, and illustrator. Wendy Savage is Fond du Lac Ojibwe. She has had 40-plus years of working as a multidisciplinary artist in beadwork, textiles, acrylics, and oils. She is also a teacher, including serving as the first art teacher at the Fond du Lac Ojibwe School, gallery curator, and art researcher. You know their art. Now take a walk with us as we learn more about their beginning artist careers.
Bonjour, hello and welcome. I'm Jill Dorfler and I'm the host for this program. I'm currently a professor and department head of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. I was born and raised on the White Earth Reservation. My mother is enrolled there and I'm a first-degree descendant. It's my pleasure to have a conversation with Ojibwe artists Wendy Savage and Carl Gawboy today. They've agreed to share some stories about their experiences in the art world and particularly about the Ojibwe Art Expo. But before I say any more and get into questions, I want to invite them to introduce themselves. Carl, if you would please go first, that would be fantastic.
Well, I was born at the Cloquet Indian Hospital in 1942, and that was when our family was living on the Vermilion Indian Reservation. But in about 1945, we moved to a farm south of Ely that my mother had inherited from her father, and that's where I grew up. So I always considered myself from Ely, and that's my hometown.
I'm Wendy Savage, and I'm an artist and an educator, and I was born in Duluth, Minnesota, and raised in Duluth, Minnesota, and then on the reservation in Cloquet at Fond du Lac in the summers. And I've been a curator, a self-taught curator for well over 40 years, and then I was also the first art teacher on the reservation, and then met Carl, and then we got involved in the Ojibwe Art Expo.
Fantastic. So let's maybe start with each of you sharing a little bit about your journeys to becoming an artist. We know that there are many pathways to the art world, and I think our listeners will be interested in just hearing a little bit about what led you to become an artist.
Well, my mother said that I could draw before I could walk, and there wasn't any question in my mind that I would be an artist someday. So when it came time to leave Ely and go to college, and I was going to go to UMD and major in art, and I had some strange idea that this would mean that I'd learn how to paint certain subjects and that I would learn how to draw certain subjects. But as it turned out, UMD in those days was all abstract expressionism. And I didn't know that a national movement during the late 30s and 40s was to get rid of all the old illustration profs in art schools all around the country. I mean, Yale, their art department used to be all illustrators, and they teach people how to illustrate for magazines, newspapers, book covers, advertising, things like that. And they fired them all in 1 year and hired abstract expressionists. So things had just flipped over, and I had no idea that this was happening. So I walked into UMD, and abstract expressionism was the rule. And I didn't find out till much, much later in reading about the different artistic movements in this country was that it is primarily the result of the Cold War, that abstract expressionism was to show the world that in the United States art was free, as opposed to the Soviet Union where socialist realism was the law. Well, as it turned out, to enforce this, you had to do abstract expressionism or you wouldn't pass. And I took a watercolor class in my sophomore year. I wanted to do landscapes of northern Minnesota and Indian culture. Strangely enough, it's what I'm doing now. And at the end of the quarter, the professor had an evaluation of everyone, and he said, Carl, you're obviously the best watercolorist in the room, but I'm going to give you a B because you didn't do any abstract expressionism. So I always like to say that I got a B from the CIA.
That's very interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing that interesting bit about how the government had a role in what was in fashion in art at the time.
Right. And there's an interesting book about it. Don't take my word for it. And it's called Who Paid the Piper? It's talking about, there's some chapters on art, but mostly it's about jazz musicians that toured behind the Iron Curtain in the 1940s that felt that they'd been used. These things were all sponsored by the CIA, their tours of Europe. And so here were black musicians who faced prejudice and discrimination at home, but toured the Eastern Europe to show how free and open America was. Strange times.
Very strange. Well, I'm glad that you kept your style and persisted despite the assignments and assistance of some professors at UMD. Wendy, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience with art and becoming an artist?
Well, my career has been really bizarre. I grew up in a large family, and we always had paper and color crayons available. But when I went to school as a child, I was in a private school, and art wasn't a subject. You only had art, like, at the holidays. So it wasn't really until college that I first experienced my first art class, and here it was at UMD. And I, of course, fell in love with pottery because I'm very good with my hands. We all have a talent, and my talent was told as, oh, she's very, very good with her hands. So then I did pottery, and I kind of just experimented in college. And then I got into teaching myself, and then the Native American art movement started. And then we also started building our clinic on the reservation. And Phil Norgard collected art the whole time they were building that clinic. And I think that's where most of my art came from. And then I realized I also didn't fit in mainstream art society, and I knew that. And so most of my artwork is basically on the Fond du Lac Reservation. Mm-hmm. I worked with Phil for years, and then I also stenciled the clinic twice with the expansion. And so my focus was basically dealing with my community and how I can uplift my community, because by me stenciling the clinic with Ojibwe designs, I impact 250 to 300 people a day going in those clinics to see that. And that clinic was a model for most of the other clinics all across the United States. And it still continues today with now the expansion of the clinic that we have on 4th Street. It's even expanded all the more that every one of our buildings on the Fond du Lac Reservation has contemporary or traditional Native American art in it. In our clinics, in even every exam room, there's artwork. And it sets the community kind of like at ease, because I hate going to the dentist. I hate going to the doctor. But if I can walk in there and say, oh, I can relate to something like that, that beautiful piece of artwork, and I know all the artists, and I walk around and I'm going, oh, there's a Carl Gawboy. Oh, there's a Jeffrey Chapman. Oh, here's my sister's work. Oh, here's my brother's work. And they all look at me and going, what is she talking about? And it's like, I know all these artists. Mm-hmm. So that's basically what I did with my artwork, and study a lot of old art, traditional art forms.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it sounds like some of your early influential experiences in some ways center around the clinic and really getting in touch with the public. This also kind of connects to a question that I was thinking about in how art has really been central in Ojibwe life and Ojibwe culture since time immemorial. And I'm wondering if you both would share a little bit about why art is important and how it functions in Ojibwe life broadly. I think you've already given one example of, like you said, when you walk into a clinic where you might be there for something that you're not very excited about, but there's a kind of beauty, there's a kind of ease, there's a kind of familiarity. And it's so interesting to think about health and well-being and those images, but thinking about other examples maybe of how art functions.
Everyday objects have always been embellished and decorated, and why wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. Because if you're going to, most of the things come from the natural environment, and if you're going to take that time to, carve that paddle, carve that knife, make that basket, why wouldn't you beautify it? Mm-hmm. And I think it's just the most human thing that we can do is we create art, and it's just natural. It just all comes natural, and then painting and all these other newer invention things started coming in, and then you experiment with paint, you experiment with oil pastels and cloth, mm-hmm. And cloth,
textiles.
And I like textiles, and I like doing historical research. This is all before the internet, and UMD and the College of St. Scholastica had wonderful libraries, and I love going into libraries all by myself and just going through books and looking and researching odd things that nobody does.
Mm-hmm. And whenever I had a question about how something was made or whether something is still being made, I always asked Wendy, because if she didn't know, she'd find out. And talking to her people I'm just thinking of one thing about yarn bags, which was a modest little art form that came through the fur trade, mm-hmm. and made with yarn and different kinds of trade materials. And I wondered if they were still being made, and Wendy came up with one that some relative has made. My eyes just went as big as saucers. So as Wendy said, I think the Ojibwe, just like many other Indian cultures, their art was part of their everyday life. They, whether you're doing what you wore or your tools or your, the things that you used every single day, they were decorated if they could, and there's something about that mindset that continues into the present day, where even in the most remotest reservation in Canada, there are painters hard at work in their home studios making art that are shown in Toronto and Ottawa and Europe. I mean, it's part of our legacy, I think, to make beautiful things.
And I think innovation is inherently connected in that. Sometimes I think in the outside world there might be a sort of stereotype when it comes to American Indian art, which we'll talk about maybe more directly.
Yeah, exactly. People think that Indians are so bound up in tradition that they don't move out of some mythical past somehow.
We're still doing rock paintings, which are fantastic and wonderful, but also, there's many...
Their history shows that any time a new material is introduced, it takes them, maybe about 3 minutes to decide how they could incorporate that into their design or into what they wear.
Yeah. I also want to hear from both of you, Wendy and Carl, about a little bit more about your own art. So if you'd like to share with us one of the first pieces that you sold or first exhibits that you were in, some of the early things from your career that were really monumental for you, and roll through and tell us a little bit about your career sort of through time as well.
When I was about a sophomore in college, I was working in summers for the Forest Service, and we were 10 days out and 4 days in. That is, our 10 days out were clearing portages and cleaning campgrounds and doing all the things that the Forest Service grunts were expected to do. So I was out there And the Forest Service plane landed on our lake and flew me back to Ely. And they took me up to the ranger station where the head ranger called me into his office, and he said, "I suppose you wonder why we flew you in." I thought it was some kind of emergency.
Yeah.
And he said, no, he wanted a painting done. And he said, a white-tailed deer with a big set of antlers next to a big white pine. And so I went home. So that was like,
It's like your first
I was supposed to have been out working in the woods swatting mosquitoes. But I went home and I did his painting, and he bought it. And when he retired, of course, he took the painting back to his retirement. And that was the first real sale.
Yeah. Commission, right?
Yeah, commission besides.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Amazing. Wendy, do you have a story about a first, something like that?
I was going back over my resume, my 15-page resume, and I was thinking the first professional art show I did actually was here at Tweed. And it was in 1978, and it was for the Minnesota Craft Council. And I don't have those pieces that I put in. I think one was a batik piece, and the other one might have been a weaving. I don't remember. And I don't remember the first art piece that I sold, but I do remember the Raven Gallery down in Minneapolis. And I think that would have been like the first gallery that I really showed in. So I did sell a piece there, and it was a birch bark cutout design. And I think Richard and Dorothy Nelson bought it. But I'm not as prolific as a bunch of other artists usually are. And like I said before, most of my artwork is at the clinic and all around the reservation. I don't like commissions. I'm not good at that. And I like just doing what I'm doing at the moment. I change constantly, which really gets people mixed up because they really think that if you're a watercolorist, you just stick with watercolors. Well, I'm not doing pottery anymore. I'm not doing photography anymore. And the weaving that I'm doing, I was studying that Sami band weaving. But right now, instead of painting, which I used to do, I'm back to sewing. I'm back to, again, working with fibers right now because I want to research this applique process. So I get bored easily and I change easily. And I decided I don't want to teach anymore. It's too much work. And so I'm just going to sit home and write grants and do what I want to do because it's time right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. It's a nice contrast, actually, because Carl, a lot of you do watercolors and you still doing watercolors, but you also have the new Fur Trade illustrated book. Do you want to share a little bit about how your materials and forms have both changed and stayed the same through your career?
Well, the dark secret of my career is that I do comics. And I've been doing that for quite a few years. And it turns out that graphic novels and graphic histories are really hot right now. And everything just kind of came together because I used to teach the history of the fur trade in the Indian studies classes. And so I thought this is the time to do it. And so it took 3 years, over 1,000 drawings.
Yeah.
And I just went ahead with it using my old notes from my college classes.
Wow.
So the problem was that a lot of my notes didn't have citations. So Rain Newcomb and I had to look up the citations. Without that, I don't think the book would have been as needed as it is now.
Yeah.
Because at the back of the book are the chapter notes, and that's a whole history all in itself.
Talk about your mural project.
Oh, this took 10 years. The murals at the Superior Public Library. And Paul Gawboy was the brainchild behind that. And he was a librarian at the Superior Public Library at that time. And he wanted a mural like in the 1930s when the WP artists did the work all over the country and did the history of their region. And he had his dream of recreating that magic time in American art when realistic artists had actual career choices. I started working on it. There was 36 paintings each one 5 feet by 7 feet. And they completely circled around the new Superior Public Library Museum. It was really fun. It took a lot of work. There were some great stories about that project, let me tell you. I don't even want to mention about when I was doing the Edmund Fitzgerald, about what some supernatural things that happened in my studio at that time. But I won't talk about it.
So we'll leave that mystery for another day.
Yes.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah, you both have had really amazing careers and have a number of ongoing projects.
Miigwech for listening to First Light, Carl Gawboy, Wendy Savage, and the Ojibwe Art Expo. Links to the other podcasts in this series, as well as links to a variety of other artist support resources, can be found online at thenorth1033.org. This has been Ivy Vineo, and this series was made possible through support from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council, and Northland Foundation's Matauking Grant. Miigwech Bizendaoyeg. Thank you for listening.